Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me in celebration of the Bath Book Bash with our special live event, A Conversation with Lois Lowry. I'm Children's Librarian Katie Dodge, your host for this evening. Last fall, we began planning the first annual Bath Book Bash as a celebration of children's literature with over 20 authors and illustrators from around New England. The event was originally planned to be held in Library Park as a family-friendly outdoor event. Although being together on computers is not quite the same as being together in the park, our commitment to children's literature is stronger than ever. Patent Free Library is pleased to share in celebrating children's books with you virtually. You can stream all of the author videos and this event on the Bath Book Bash YouTube channel and website. These sites will be made available in the chat. It is an honor to be with our guest today. The author of over 40 children's books, Lois Lowry has won the Newbery Medal for the most distinguished American children's book, not once, but twice. She first received the Newbery Medal in 1990 for her novel, Number the Stars, a story of the Danish resistance told through the eyes of 10-year-old Anne Marie. Miss Lowry also received the Newbery Medal in 1994 for her dystopian novel, The Giver. Considered one of the most influential books of our time, The Giver tells the story of 12-year-old Jonas, the receiver of memory, in his deceptively utopian world. Part of a quartet, The Giver was made into a movie in 2011 and has just been re-released as a graphic novel. Tonight, Miss Lowry will be talking about her latest book, On the Horizon, her stirring new memoir that looks back on lives forever changed after the bombings of Pearl Harbor and Hiroshima. The slim book is Miss Lowry's first novel written in verse. Each verse is a recollection of heroes, both big and small. Her reflections are brief and eloquently simple, but convey enormous feelings about humanity, war, and hope. I'm excited to learn that Miss Lowry will also be discussing her soon-to-be-released sequel to The Willoughbys, called The Willoughbys Return, the story of the horrible Willoughbys who have been frozen atop a Swiss mountain range for 30 years, and having just thawed out are making their way home again. The re-release of Like the Willow Tree, a Dear America story, will be Miss Lowry's final featured book of the evening. The story is the diary of 11-year-old Lydia from Portland. She and her brother have been orphaned by the 1918 epidemic of Spanish influenza. Lydia struggles with the changes in her life, which seem similar to the experiences readers may be having today. Also with us this evening are Morse High School English teachers, Jonna and Brian Stanton, who will be moderating the event, and RSU1 student representatives, Audrey Taylor and Harper and Avery Steenstra. Before we begin, we would like to thank Jason Ritchie State Farm for supporting the Bath Book Bash, and Mockingbird Bookshop is also a supporter and has pre-order signed copies of Miss Lowry's books available through September. Now I would like to discuss the format for the event. Jonna and Brian will facilitate the conversation with Miss Lowry until approximately 6:30. The Stantons will then be joined by RSU1 student representatives until about 6:45. We will end the evening with questions from the audience. There are over 100 registered participants for the event. So please use the chat feature on Zoom to submit any questions you may have for Miss Lowry. Make sure your chat is set to send to everyone. Questions for Miss Lowry will only be answered that are submitted through the chat feature. This event is being recorded. You will be able to find it on the Bath Book Bash YouTube channel and website. Please be sure to subscribe. Also, in order to see the presenters, please set your Zoom to speaker view, which you can find in the upper right corner of the screen. I would now like to turn it over to our moderators, Brian and Jonna Stanton.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
How do you do, Miss Lowry?
Hi there.
Welcome and thank you very much for coming.
Yeah.
We also wanted, for us, we're very grateful for the patent-free library, and we're really lucky in Bath to have such a great library that reaches out. Can you talk about your experience with libraries, either in research as an adult or as a child?
I could talk about my experience with libraries all night, but I don't want to bore you. I will just tell you that when I was a little girl, from 1st to 6th grade, I lived in a small town in Pennsylvania. And every Sunday, I went dutifully with my mother and my sister to Sunday school at the Presbyterian Church. But my real church in that town and my real religion, I confess, was at the public library, which was within walking distance of my grandparents' home. I lived with my grandparents when my father was overseas during the war. And I remembered that library fondly all my life. I left that town at the end of 6th grade when I went to live in Japan. And I always remembered that library as almost like a cathedral. I remembered walking up 100 marble steps to get into that awesome building. And when I was an adult, probably in my 50s, I was invited back to that town to speak at that library. And I discovered it was just 10 cement steps. It had meant so much to me. It had magnified itself in my memory. I'll tell you another story about that library. As I say, I could go on all night, and I couldn't. But I remember when I was 10, checking out a book that was not in the children's section. I think I'd read every book in the children's section. And I checked out a book called A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, which was a popular but adult book at that time. I was attracted to it by the title because I had lived briefly in Brooklyn before I moved to Pennsylvania. And by the time I got home, and it was only 3 blocks, my mother met me at the door and said the librarian had called her to tell her that I had taken out an inappropriate book. And my mother asked to see what the book was, and I showed her, and she smiled and gave it back to me. I've remembered that book fondly all my life in the same way that I've remembered the library fondly all my life. I also, of course, have used libraries many, many, many times for research on various books. Not recently, my library in Falmouth, Maine is currently closed, but I'll just tell you one very brief, very funny story that only adults will be amused by. Kids, bear with me. But many years ago, I was doing research on a book, and I needed information that I could find at Widener Library at Harvard in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I lived in Maine at the time. And I needed a library card. I had to be a member of that to enter. And so somebody I knew got me the loan of someone else's library card. And so I went disguised as that person. And so for those 2 days, I was Henry Kissinger's first wife. Ann Kissinger was my name.
That is a fantastic story. Well, speaking of marvelous books that you can find in library, we both really enjoyed reading your memoir, Looking Back. And the pictures are magnificent. How were they maintained all these years so that you could use them in this memoir?
Some, of course, are better than others, but my father, though it wasn't his profession, was a fabulous photographer, and he always had very good photographic equipment. And he always had a dark room in our home. We moved a lot. My father was a military officer. My mother used to complain that before she had a place to put down her sewing machine, my father had commandeered some space for his dark room. But that meant that we ended up with, instead of the little black and white snapshots that most people have from those long ago years, we ended up with 8 by 10 beautiful photographs. And some of those, of course, have been lost over the years, but I did end up with enough that I could use some of them in that book. That my father's history as a photographer also plays into the the new book, Under the not under, excuse me, On the Horizon, which began with my father's photography. But maybe we'll get to that in a minute.
Great.
And well, back to looking back, your mother finished college in the 1920s, which is incredibly impressive.
No, better than that. Wait a minute. My grandmother, and all three of her sisters all graduated from college before 1900.
That's incredible.
That was unusual in those days for women.
Absolutely.
And so the role of education through your life, even before you were around, it's been incredible. Can you talk about the importance of the education?
Well, education in general, but let me talk about the importance of literature and books in my life. I was so fortunate to be born into a household that valued books. I never knew a moment in my life that I wasn't surrounded by books, that I wasn't on my grandmother's lap or my grandfather's lap or my mother's lap or sitting next to my sister being read to. That was so much a part of my life that just permeated my existence. And I'm so fortunate that way.
We love the picture of you guys playing school.
Yeah.
My sister and me, she taught me to read.
Yeah, that's pretty special.
She would read to me, and she would explain how the letters had sounds, and the sounds went together to make words. I was 3 and she was 6, and she had started first grade. And so she came home every day and taught me that. And that picture you're talking about is her reading to me in my pajamas, listening intently. And every now and then she would tilt the book over so I could see the picture. It was never long enough. And she would say, pay attention. She was being a teacher, but she taught me to read.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Let's talk a little bit about On the Horizon. In your book On the Horizon, you write, we never knew. And you also say, I didn't see. Do you feel that we have a responsibility to see? And did you feel like as a small child, you did something wrong? Or were you just acknowledging that we need to see?
You know, I think I can answer that question, but I better explain the book or people won't know what I'm talking about.
Yes.
I mentioned my father's photography. He also took home movies and had, for that time, very fancy movie equipment. I mean, nowadays everybody can take videos without even thinking about it, but it was unusual then. I was born in 1937, and I was born in Honolulu. So we ended up with home movies. And I'm thinking in particular of a sequence of film of me playing on the beach at Waikiki with my grandmother standing beside me, and she had come to visit from Wisconsin. And I had seen that bit of movie and the larger movie that was encompassed by a zillion times when we were growing up, because we had no television. It was very exciting if Daddy got out the movie projector. And if we asked him to, he could run things backwards and we could see Mommy walking backwards. I mean, it's so silly now. But I had seen that movie many, many times. And then I was an adult. My father was getting old. I visited, and he showed me these old reels of film, and they were beginning to deteriorate. And I took them back to Boston with me and had them transferred to videotape. This would have been in maybe around 1980, back when videotape was a thing. Of course, that's now obsolete too. And so I had that videotape, and before I returned it to my father, I showed it in my living room. I just bought a VCR. It was brand new to me. And so I made my dinner guests, I bored them by making them watch old movies of me as a baby. And there's the scene of me playing on the beach at Waikiki. One of my guests was a Boston lawyer who had retired from the Navy before he went to law school and became a lawyer as a second career. He'd been a captain of a nuclear submarine. And it was he who said, can you stop and reverse and go back and show the scene on the beach again? I mean, this was so new to me, I had to figure out how to pause and rewind. And I showed him the beach scene again. And he pointed out something I had never noticed, as you just pointed out, that it says in the book, I never saw, I didn't see. He's pointed out because he could identify the silhouette. In the background was the Arizona. Kids won't recognize that name, but the Arizona was the battleship sunk at Pearl Harbor with 1,100 and some young men aboard. And so it's that the book refers to, and it shows that picture, I think, in the book. I did research on who those young men were on that ship. Of course, everybody has a story. You do, I do, everybody does. And so did those 1,100 young men. And I selected just a few of them and wrote about those young men in the book. And in the second third of the book, I did the same thing with those who had been at Hiroshima 4 years later. And now I've forgotten what your question was, but it had to do with, in the book, it says, referring to the ship in the background, me playing, giggling, laughing. Of course, the movies in those days didn't have sound, but you can see a breeze blows my hat and I grab it and you can see that I'm laughing. And in the background are 1,100 young men who will very soon all be dead. And the book says, I can't quote it exactly, but it says, I didn't see, I didn't know. And your question was, should I have known? Could I have? I mean, we all pay attention to what's around us to the degree that we can. And we can't know it all, but we can go back to the things that matter, the things that are important, and we can assess how important they were and think about them. And that's important, I think.
Mm-hmm. And we really enjoyed On the Horizon and the illustrations as well. Can you talk about your relationship with the illustrator?
It'll be a very brief answer because I've never met him. Without describing the whole book, this won't mean much, but I asked Alan Say if he would illustrate the book. He becomes part of the book later on because he was part of my childhood and reappeared in my life when we were both not only adults, but getting old. In fact, I had an email from Alan, who's a very fine illustrator, and those of you who don't know his name, had an email from him recently. Alan is Japanese. And he said at the beginning of the pandemic, he said, we're in a different war now, and we're both on the same side this time. Because I had known him as a Japanese child when I was an American child in Japan. Now, again, I've forgotten what your question was. I go rattling.
No, I think you answered it.
Yeah.
Oh, about the illustrator. So
yeah.
Alan couldn't do the illustrations because he was under contract for, I think he said 4 different books with deadlines. He just didn't have the time. So the publisher found the illustrator, and we had planned to meet. We were going to be talking together at a bookstore in San Francisco last April. And he lives in San Francisco. And of course, everything was canceled beginning April. So we still have never met, but we did an NPR interview over the radio, but which we did him talking by phone, and I was at a studio in Portland. And he sounds like a lovely man, and he has a brand new baby who's absolutely adorable. I know because I see pictures of her, but we've never met.
Nice. Very nice.
And why poetry, and how did it feel to write the poems for that?
I'm not sure I can answer the why, except that when I began thinking about these things, first of all, I was haunted by that image of the Arizona behind me playing on the beach. And so then I began, as I told you, reading about those young men, and the different pieces of the book began to come to me in images. There was no narrative, there's no plot to the book. It's bits and pieces, and they took different forms, and it just sort of wrote itself that way. And I can't explain why, but it did seem to work. Some of them are more, what's the word I want? More strict in their poetic form than others. They take different forms. I suppose teachers will enjoy that in English teachers, as you are, pointing out the different kinds of poetry. But it just, because it was fragments, those little stories of, and let me just tell you one more thing, because I go on too long, but after the book was published and after the book tour was canceled, and so I did not go to the 7 cities where I was supposed to meet people and talk about it, I got an email. One of the poems in the book is about a man, a sailor on the ship who died that day, whose name was James Myers. And most of them were 17, 18, 21 years old. He was in his 20s. He was slightly older, and he had 2 children. He had 2 little boys, and they're mentioned on the page in which I wrote about him, mentioned by name, Jimmy and Gordon. And he died that day, leaving those 2 little boys. And after the book was published, I got an email, and the email said, "I'm Gordon. I'm James Myers' son." And it was startling and touching, because I thought of James Myers as someone who was tragically gone at such a young age, and yet he isn't gone. He's in the book, and he has this child who now, I didn't ask Gordon how old he is, but I'm guessing he's in his 80s, and he probably has children and grandchildren. And so that young man does live on. That wasn't me, I swear.
Not you. That was not you. Well, that's wonderful. So let's turn a little bit, because we're so short on time. We have, so many questions for you that we want to talk about, but let's talk a little bit about the Willoughbys. We have read it, but we thought, we'd better watch this movie. So we spent a few nights this week.
Oh, I'd forgotten that the Willoughbys was also a movie. And oh dear.
And we have questions about that process, but because we're short on time, we thought probably the best question to ask would be, can you tell us anything about what's next, what we should expect with the return of the Willoughbys? Any teasers you want to share?
The Willoughbys in the first book, I've forgotten, it was published about 10 years ago, I think. This doesn't often happen in children's books or books for young people. Usually the parents are benevolent, wonderful people with great wisdom. But these parents are terrible. They're horrible parents, and the kids hate them, and they hate the kids, which was kind of fun for me to do that. And so the kids form a plot to get rid of the parents, and they succeed. And so by the end of the book, the parents are frozen solid on top of an Alp, presumably dead. And good riddance, we all feel, because they were awful. So in the new book, Then a filmmaker wanted to make a movie, and it was coming out on Netflix this spring. And so the publisher came to me and said, "Hey, this movie's coming out. People will start to think about the Willoughbys again. Why don't you write a sequel?" So I did, but golly, the parents were dead. What should I do? And so global warming entered the scene. It became a topic, and the Alps have melted. It's 30 years later. And in the first pages, the snow melts in the Alps, and these 2 people emerge, still grouchy, horrible people, but they haven't aged. They've been frozen in a suspended animation, or whatever you call it. And so they make their way with difficulty back to where their children are, but their children are now older than they are. So that makes for all sorts of complications, and has a happy ending, unlike the first book where I kill them all. They're alive at the end of the second book, and happy.
All right. Okay.
The movie, incidentally, was not at all like the book.
Yeah.
And the movie people would not let me read the script. So to write a sequel, I didn't know how the movie was going to end. And I confess I watched part of the movie, but not all the way to the ending. So I don't know where the parents are at the end of the movie.
Well, as we always say, the book is better than the movie. So, I mean, but it was fun to sort of see. And, we did have a question about, how do you feel when you have this product that you've crafted, and then, it gets turned into a movie or it's illustrated, and a lot of that is sort of out of your hands.
Yeah, well, The Giver has been an opera,
Oh my
been a
God.
play. It was about to be a musical on Broadway till Broadway disappeared. So I don't know what will happen to that. But it goes out, any book, this can happen to any book, they become different things. And the thing to remember from the author's point of view is that the book still exists. It doesn't change the book. And so I've quit worrying about it. That's not true. I do worry about it, but I've quit complaining about it.
Yeah.
And with like the willow tree, we want to make sure we definitely talk about that as well. A very timely publication.
Yes. Yeah.
And how much editing did you have to do to get it ready, and what brought it to the forefront for you?
Okay, the Like the Willow Tree is part of a series published by Scholastic called Dear America. And each of those books centers around a historic event in the United States told through the eyes of a child who is on the periphery of that event. The publisher called me, this is some years ago, and asked if I'd like to do one. They're each done by different authors. And each one is usually in the form of a diary of this child. And of a child. So they called and asked if I'd like to do one. I said, yeah, it'd be fun. And they asked me if I would do the San Francisco earthquake, which would have been great fun. Fun is the wrong word, but it would have been an exciting project, a fun project for me. However, I had family and a dog, and it would have been tough to spend a lot of time in San Francisco. So I said no to that. And they asked if I had any suggestions. And I have a summer home in Western Maine, which is quite near the Shaker Village at Sabbath Day Lake. And so I suggested that I do a book set there. But the child who is the protagonist of the book is an orphan taken in by the Shakers, which is how the Shakers increased in numbers since they didn't marry and were celibate. They took in orphans. And so I made the book set in 1918 in Portland, Maine, and the child who lives in Woodford, if you know Portland, is orphaned when her parents both die of the 1918 Spanish flu. And so she is taken to the Shakers, and most of the book takes place there. But it does depict, and I did the research on this as well, the circumstances during that time of the flu. It was very interesting. This, of course, I did the book long before our current situation took place, but as this pandemic evolved, I began to see the similarities. In this book, the child's father says he doesn't understand why other stores have closed down. He's going into the store where he works. He's going to keep working. And the child is mad because her birthday is next week, and her parents had promised they would take her to the movies. Well, movies were brand new in Portland, Maine in 1918. I looked up what was playing at the movies, and she has to miss it, and she can't figure out why, because nobody she knows is sick, and she'd like to be in the movie. So a lot of the same kinds of things we're experiencing now, and the same kinds of tragedies.
Yeah, that's great. And so it must have been interesting to see it come out now when, you know, a lot of the same themes are so relevant that, you know, we're watching this unfold.
Yes, of course, this book, the original book, which I've got a copy of it right here, if I can see the year of publication, was some years ago. This was published in 2011. So that's 9 years ago. And it had had its life. And then suddenly the publisher called me, I've forgotten how long ago, maybe 4 months ago, and said, we've decided to put a new cover on this book. I haven't seen the new cover. Maybe I can show you this one.
Nice.
Wow.
Oh.
That's very different than the new one.
Have you seen the new one? On the,
Yes.
on the new jacket, they told me they were going to put a mask on the girl.
Yeah, they did.
So that will make it seem very timely.
Yeah.
When I leave this sitting in front of my computer right at this moment and go out my door, I'm going to put on that same mask.
Absolutely.
So it did seem very timely, and it will give the book a new life.
So we have one last question before I hand it over to the important interviewers. You write, you don't know what it is about me and dogs. So what is it about you and dogs?
Lois, I understand, but my husband does not.
For those of you who don't recognize what he's quoting from, that's from the memoir called Looking Back, I assume, in which I described how I chose the breed of dog that would suit me. And I did get that dog, who is pictured in that book. That book was published a long time ago, and sadly, that dog has gone to the big kennel in the sky. But I have gotten a second dog of the same breed for the same reasons described in the book. And this one, I can feel him as we speak with my feet, because he is always lying right at my feet if he's not at my lap. And he's also sadly getting old, because that's what happens to dogs. But in answer to your question, I don't know what it is about me and dogs. I have always had dogs all my life.
I'll accept that as an answer.
That is a wonderful answer. Wonderful. So thank you so much for chatting with us. We are going to turn things over. Our first question comes from Audrey.
And are we going to get to see Audrey?
I think so.
Hello, Miss Lowry. My name is Audrey Taylor, and I'm a 5th grade student for Bath. My question for you is, what did you have in mind when you wrote the ending to The Giver, and what did the ending mean to you?
Okay.
Or what does?
The ending of The Giver is very ambiguous. You don't know exactly. Usually when a book ends, you've gotten to know the people and the circumstances in the book enough that you know what would happen next. And you don't know when The Giver ends. However, when I wrote it, I thought it was an optimistic ending. I was surprised when a lot of readers thought that the boy was dead at the end of that book. However, some years later, I did sit down and write a second book, and then a third, and finally a fourth. And by the fourth book, Jonas, the one who is not dead at age 12, at the end of The Giver, is all grown up, married, and has 2 children. So you know that he lives. And more than that, if you read all the books, you know where he is and what he's doing and what his circumstances are.
Thank you. And now, Harper and Avery have some questions for you.
Thank you, Audrey. Hello, my name is Harper, and my question for you is, what's your favorite character from the stories you've written?
Oh my, that's a hard question, because, you know, when I write a book and create a character, I begin to feel as if I am that character. I get to know them so well. So I love all my characters. I become very close to them. And yet there are 2 books. They go way back, so you probably haven't written them. And the one was actually my very first book. It was called A Summer to Die. And the other was probably 3 books later, and it was called Autumn Street. And both of those books were written like a story. They were written like fiction, but they're really, the main character is me. They're really autobiographical. They both deal with sad subjects. My sister, the one who taught me to read, died young. And so the first book is about the death of a teenage girl, told from the point of view of her younger sister. And the other one is also me. In the first book, I named myself Meg. And in the other one, Autumn Street, I'm called Elizabeth. And both of those characters are the ones that I'm closest to, because they're still in me. They're the younger versions of myself.
Thank you. And now my sister would like to ask you a question.
Thank you, Harper. Hello, Miss Lowry. My name is Avery, and I'm in 7th grade. I would love to be a writer someday, and was wondering if you have any advice for students with that dream.
Well, you know, I'm often asked that by young people who want to be writers. And it turns out almost always, and I'm sure this is true of you, they're already doing what my advice would be. which is reading a lot. That's really how you learn to write. Reading everything. I don't think it matters what you major in college. I don't think it matters how many pages you sit down and write a day. But if you read a lot, that enters you, and it comes out. What you've learned from that process will come out in your own writing, but yours will be your own. It will have your own feel to it, but you will incorporate all you've learned from all you've read. I've remembered, I've forgotten many of the books I've read too, but I've remembered so many books from my childhood and I'm 83 years old. That's a lot of books over a lot of years. And those have all meant something to me, and I've learned something about writing from every one of them. Sometimes I've learned what not to do when I've read books that aren't very good. But I said, I bet you're already doing this, and you can confirm that for me, right?
Yes,
You're
I
already
read a lot of books.
You can't be a writer unless you're a reader.
Thank you, Miss Lowry. And now back to Miss Katie.
Wow, thanks everyone. We will now take some questions from the audience. And the first question is from Sophie. And she asks, how did you get the idea for Anastasia Krupnik?
I love that question, because sometimes when I'm asked how I got an idea for something, I don't really remember. And I have to say it just came into my imagination. But Anastasia Krupnik, I can describe exactly where she came from. But I have to go back in my own past. My father was a dentist in the Army. And so during my teenage years, when I was in college, my father was the chief of dental services at Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, D.C. Okay? I mean, that's not fascinating, but it's necessary to understand what I'm answering here. During that time, he was the dentist for the president and the vice president and their families. And Richard Nixon was the vice president. And he had two daughters. They were sort of about the ages of my sister and me. Dad would come home from the office, and at dinner sometimes he would say, Julie and Tricia were in today. And my sister and I would look at each other and roll our eyes. We never met the Nixon daughters, but Dad would say, they brushed their teeth 1,000 times a day. They flossed. They were such polite, lovely girls. And my sister and I would go, yuck. We couldn't stand Julie and Tricia. I mean, I'm sure they're wonderful human beings, but we were being obnoxious teenagers. Okay, so I always after that had a weird interest in presidential daughters. And in I guess it would have been 77 or 78, it was time to write another book. And I'd written a couple of very serious, even sad books. And I decided it was time to write an amusing book. And I created a character, and I based her on a presidential daughter. So here's your Jeopardy question. Who was president of the United States in 1978? Dum, 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 dum. It was Jimmy Carter. Mm-hmm. His daughter, Amy, was 10 years old. And I loved Amy Carter, whom I never met, but I would see her on TV, and she misbehaved. She had a tantrum at an airport once. One time I saw a journalist, a reporter, stick a microphone in front of this 10-year-old child and ask, do you have anything to say to the children of the world? And she looked at him and said, no. And I thought, she is so cool. So I based Anastasia Krupnik, age 10, on Amy Carter. And in the description of her appearance, that's what she looked like. However, often when a book goes to be published and the publisher hires an illustrator for the cover, sometimes the illustrator doesn't read the book carefully, and so they don't use the exact details that you hope they would use. And Anastasia's hair on many of the book covers is very dark. And it was not supposed to be, because Amy Carter had reddish blonde hair, and so did Anastasia when I wrote her, but somehow they got her wrong in the illustrations. But that's how I got the idea for her and her personality, which is very different from my personality at that age, because I was a very quiet, scholarly, shy, introspective child. Amy Carter was an obnoxious brat and very appealing. She was funny and probably very popular because she was outgoing. And so I envied that. That's the child I wanted to be. And so that's what I created for that book. And then having created the character, of course, you have to give her problems to face and adventures. And I think there are 9 books about her, and she gets a little older in each one. And I always tried to think of circumstances that would present a problem for a kid of that age, which she will solve by the end of the book, and which other kids that age would face. In one book, she moves and has to make friends in a new town and go to a new school. And one book, she's in 7th grade and she has no money, so she tries to get a job. They're not world-shaking problems. They're lighthearted, and she has wonderful parents. She has the kind of parents that I loved my parents, and I have wonderful parents, but I would have loved having Anastasia's parents. They're funny and smart. My parents were smart. I don't think they were terribly funny. So anyway, Sophie, that's where Anastasia came from. I wonder if anybody's ever told Amy Carter that. She's probably in her 60s by now.
That was our follow-up question. Does Amy Carter know she is Anastasia?
Well, if she does, she's never told me. She's never gotten in touch with me. Although incidentally, she went to the same college I did, Brown University, many years after I was there. And guess what? She got kicked out. Sorry.
Oh my gosh.
She was either flunked out or got kicked out for other behavior. She was being a bad girl in her young years.
Well, thank you so much. The next question is from Chelsea. She asks, do you have a preference between writing about the past, the present, or more of a futuristic alternate reality setting like The Giver?
You know, I'm currently working on the beginnings of a new book, which is set in the distant past. Books set in the past require a lot of research. The book Number of the Stars is set in the not so distant past. It was the past of my childhood. It's now considered a historic time because it's that long ago. The future, you know, I don't like science fiction, so I don't really want to write about the future in a way that involves the technology of the future. That's too hard for me. But I did enjoy writing the 4 books that make up the Giver Quartet because it gave me a chance to make up worlds that don't exist and to create something entirely from my imagination. Most of my books have been set in the present time. That has its own problems, however. And I've encountered those problems with the Anastasia books, which are set a few years back, but they were still contemporary books. And that is if you try to make them appealing to young readers by using a lot of current things, popular groups, songs, whatever is popular at that time, then the book becomes obsolete very quickly. And I've looked back at some of the Anastasia books and some of the references, and they're out of date. For example, again, the kids listening to this will not recognize this, and yet it's in the book. Anastasia has a baby brother who is born at the end of the first book. She's 10 years old. The next book is 2 years later, and her brother is 2 years old. And it's describing her brother, Sam, and he's unusually bright and articulate and verbal. And it says something like, Anastasia's brother had been talking like Walter Cronkite since he was 1.5 years old. Well, Who knows who Walter Cronkite is? I do, but I'm 83, and kids don't. So I should have been more careful about references like that, except that they're fun at the time when you do them. So that's one thing you have to be aware of and careful of if you're writing a contemporary book.
Thank you. The next question is from Grace. She asks, I just finished reading Like the Willow Tree with my mom. What sparked your interest in the Shaker community?
Well, as I just described, I was looking for a piece of American history. And in the summertime, I live not far from that community, and I've gone there several times and taken tours of it. And it's really a fascinating bit of history. And then to combine that with the history of the flu epidemic made it doubly interesting. I don't know that there was anything in particular that sparked my interest in that, except that there it is. And it's, if you live in Maine, and I know not all of you watching this do live in Maine, but for those of us who do, you can go to that village. I think the tours are only given in the summertime, but they're very, very interesting. And it's a piece of history that we shouldn't forget about.
Thank you. This is a question from Cheryl. What influence has Maine had on your writing?
What influence has Maine had on my writing? I think I've written 45 books, and I'd have to go back and look through them to see how many are set in Maine. Most are not. Several books are set in New York, where I lived as a teenager. And yet the influence, I think, that comes to my mind that clearly has affected me is the fact that Maine is a place where I can be solitary. I have 2 homes in Maine, and I'm sitting in one in Falmouth now in front of a bookcase, you can see. Have you ever noticed how people on Zooms always try to sit in front of bookcases? That's to show how intelligent we are. But I also have an old farmhouse in Western Maine. And there are also books there and bookcases, but there's a lot of history there. My house was built in 1768 or 69. It was the first house in that part of Maine. And it's also somewhat isolated. So it's a perfect place to sit. I was there last week, and to sit there, and it's quiet and it's beautiful, and the wind blows and the flowers are still blooming. And I suppose you could find such a place anywhere, but for me, I find it in Maine.
Thank you. Sounds like something that is appealing to all of us. The last question is from Emerson, and this is about The Giver. The Giver was recently released as a graphic novel. Are there plans to release the others in the quartet as graphic novels? And have you found that this has helped to expand your audience to new generations of readers?
I'm not aware of any plans for other graphic novels. That could happen. It's something that the publisher takes on. They ask my permission, of course. And I think Craig Russell, who did the graphic novel of The Giver, did a wonderful job. I especially love the cover. I wish I had one here to hold up. And he did keep the original text. I mean, not every word in the book is in the graphic novel, but he made the correct selections, and he used my words rather than rewriting the book. I think it probably does expand the audience, because there are always kids who gravitate toward graphic novels. And I don't know how we could describe who those kids are or why that's their preference. But those kids who like that form have liked it enough that all publishers now are publishing graphic novels, and some of them are beautifully done. When I was a kid, we had comic books, which is not exactly the same thing, though there are similarities. But graphic novels today can actually be very fine literature. We did have something when I was a kid called classic comics, which were classic books retold in comic form, but they were very boring. They were not half as much fun as Captain Marvel, which was the comic that I read once a month when it came out, or Little Lulu. So I think that the graphic novel is a kind of new phenomenon, and it's it's an exciting one because it's opened up the world of books to a number of young people who would not otherwise be reading.
Great. Well, thank you. I guess we'll start wrapping up for the evening. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. And of course, a special thanks to Lois Lowry. It's an honor to have this conversation with you this evening. And please remember to join us virtually on the Bath Book Bash YouTube and our website. And also, you could purchase your autographed copies of Miss Lowry's books at the Mockingbird Bookshop. Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Bye, Lois. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
We
you.
love you.
That was fun.
It was very nice to meet you. You were wonderful.
Oh,
Thank you.
you are one of our all-time favorites. Thank
Oh,
you.
Thank you. Thank you. I wish we could be sitting in person in the same room, but this has been fun. Thank you all so much.
Well, I probably couldn't handle it, so this was good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.